Kyle Richards and Mauricio Umansky were once considered one of reality TV's most unshakable love stories. For years, they symbolized stability inside the Real Housewives of Beverly Hills universe, a landscape often dominated by chaos, breakups, and headline-making meltdowns. So when news broke that their marriage had fractured, the shockwave hit harder than anyone expected. Fans weren't just surprised, they were heartbroken. Because for more than a decade, viewers followed their journey. We watched Kyle cheering Mauricio on as he built the agency into a global empire. We watched Mauricio grounding Kyle during season after season of RHOBH tension, always appearing as the level-headed partner behind the diamonds and drama. To many fans, they weren't just a couple on TV, they were a glimmer of hope that Hollywood love could last. But just like the Kelly and Mark story that blindsided America, the unraveling of Kyle and Mauricio's marriage wasn't a simple tabloid headline. It became a cultural moment, a story about growth, heartbreak, reinvention, and what happens when the life you built begins to shift beneath your feet. So let's start where the world first felt that sting, the announcement. When Kyle and Mauricio confirmed they were separated, the RHOBH fandom went into freefall. People weren't treating this like any regular celebrity split. They reacted as though a piece of their own belief in long-term love had been shattered. Especially longtime viewers who had invested 13 seasons into the Richards-Umansky family dynamic. It didn't feel like gossip, it felt personal. But once that initial shock wore off, eyes turned to Mauricio. What would he do next? Would he quietly step away from the spotlight? Would he lay low? Or would he walk directly into a new chapter? This is where the story took its first twist. Instead of hiding, Mauricio opened up. And instead of bitterness, he embraced vulnerability, something rare for a man often seen as the calm, composed backbone of RHOBH. His first public comments weren't designed for drama or ratings. They sounded almost like a man exhaling after carrying decades of expectations. He spoke about transitions, personal growth, and the complicated reality of evolving separately from someone you still deeply care about. He didn't frame the separation as a collapse of their love story, but as an unexpected turn in a much larger journey. That honesty resonated with millions of viewers who had experienced their own breakups, their own turning points, their own painful but necessary stages of reinvention. And then came the real plot twist, his actions. Rather than filling his calendar with distractions or trying to replace what was lost, Mauricio turned inward. He dedicated time to his daughters. He recentered himself in family, even as the family dynamic itself shifted. Fans took notice. It didn't feel like PR. It felt human. It felt real. But Mauricio didn't stop there. As rumors swirled around his friendship with other women, his career moves, and even his time on Dancing with the Stars, he continued pushing forward with something more important, rediscovering who he was outside of being Kyle's husband. Not out of spite, not to prove anything, but to rebuild himself from the inside out. And that resonated even deeper with fans who saw pieces of their own journeys in him. Of course, the public also wanted to know, what about Kyle? For Kyle Richards, the separation shook more than just her marriage. It shifted her entire identity in the eyes of viewers. She had always blended her personal life with her career in a way few reality stars could manage. For years, she presented her family as proof that real love, loyalty, and partnership could survive Bravo-level scrutiny. Suddenly, that image cracked. And unlike some celebrities who fire back with anger or denial, Kyle moved differently. She got quieter, more reflective, more guarded. She started exploring new friendships, new interests, and maybe even new emotional connections, all while the world watched, dissected, and speculated. Kyle's journey didn't look like Mauricio's. His looked steady, inward, grounded. Hers looked like a woman trying to understand who she had become after decades of being a wife, a mother, a peacemaker, and a Beverly Hills icon. But here's what made this chapter so compelling. Neither of them played the victim. Neither played the villain. And both allowed themselves to evolve without tearing the other down. That is why this story, like the Kelly and Mark example, became bigger than reality TV. It became a mirror for people everywhere who have experienced major shifts in their lives. It showed that endings aren't always disasters. Sometimes they're beginnings disguised as heartbreak. Mauricio's first step encouraged people to reflect. Kyle's first step encouraged people to grow. And together, they showed that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is change. But if there's one thing we've learned from watching Kyle and Mauricio over the years, it's this: their story rarely moves in a straight line. Just when the public feels like they figured out where things are headed, a new layer unfolds. And this next layer, the one that came after the dust settled, may have been the most unexpected of all. Because once the camera stopped rolling and the world moved on to the next headline, Kyle and Mauricio were left with something much quieter: the reality of redefining a family. And that is where things got complicated. Not because of anger, not because of legal battles or explosive accusations, but because Kyle and Mauricio didn't want to tear down the life they built. They just needed to change how they lived inside of it. They were still attending family dinners. They were still showing up to events together. They were still communicating with a warmth that didn't look anything like a typical Hollywood split. Fans were confused. People whispered, "Are they back together?" Others argued, "They're just co-parenting." But the truth was much more nuanced. They weren't clinging to the past, and they weren't sprinting toward new lives. They were trying to navigate a strange, vulnerable space that exists between love and reinvention, a space most people don't show on camera. But Kyle did something people didn't expect. She opened up about it. In interviews and even in confessionals, she admitted she was searching for who she was now, the woman she had become after 27 years of marriage, decades on reality television, and a lifetime of prioritizing everyone else before herself. This wasn't rebellion. This wasn't scandal. This was self-discovery, happening in real time under the brightest spotlight imaginable. And whether fans loved her or criticized her, they watched because it felt real. Meanwhile, Mauricio's path looked different, but it held its own kind of weight. As the agency expanded internationally, he found himself juggling personal transformation with professional evolution. The pressure was enormous, because when your family life changes, your work life is affected too, no matter how successful you are. He began appearing more often in public, leaning into new projects, new opportunities, even new hobbies, almost like a man rediscovering pieces of himself he'd misplaced over the years. And instead of shutting the world out, he used his journey as a chance to show vulnerability. Not weakness, not defeat, vulnerability. And that struck a chord that corporate CEOs, parents, divorcees, and even younger fans felt in their own lives. Mauricio proved that masculinity could include reflection, healing, and emotional honesty. He didn't crumble. He didn't lash out. Instead, he embraced growth, and people respected him for that. But every story with two perspectives eventually meets in the middle. And this middle ground, the place where Kyle and Mauricio's individual paths overlapped, is where the next chapter began to take shape. Because even though they were separated, they were still tethered by history, by children, by memories, and by a foundation built from decades of partnership. And whether we admit it or not, some bonds don't vanish simply because the circumstances change. During family gatherings, viewers notice something: comfort. During holiday photos, they noticed something else: unity. They weren't pretending, and they weren't forcing anything. They were simply evolving together in a new way. But make no mistake, evolution isn't painless. Behind the scenes, Kyle struggled with guilt. Guilt about the separation. Guilt about fan reactions. Guilt about the expectations she could no longer meet. She wasn't the unbreakable woman she portrayed for years. She was human, emotional, conflicted. And for the first time on RHOBH, he didn't hide it. Mauricio struggled too, because even if you love your partner, and even if you want them to grow, it is difficult watching the person you built a life with take off in a new direction, especially when you're not sure where your own direction is leading. But here's the twist. Instead of letting the separation divide them, it prompted them to communicate more honestly than ever before. For years, their marriage had been strong, but also busy. Between filming, business travel, and raising children, there wasn't always room for deep emotional check-ins. Ironically, separation forced those conversations to happen, and that opened a door neither of them expected. They began acknowledging things they hadn't said out loud before. They began expressing feelings that had been buried under years of routine. They began building a new type of relationship, one rooted not in obligation, but intentional connection. And fans saw that. They felt it. The narrative shifted from, are they getting divorced? To, how are they rewriting the meaning of family?